Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, I understand that there is a vote scheduled at 5:45, and in order to clarify the voting procedures this evening, I would initially ask, in some extent, that I be able to complete my remarks, and the following senators be permitted to speak for 5 minutes each prior to the scheduled vote. I also presume that Senator Tuberville will speak while he reserves his right to object. Is that correct? So you do not need time. Thank you. In that case, I would ask that Senator Lee, Senator Hirono, Senator Bennett, and Senator Marshall be granted 5 minutes each prior to the scheduled vote.
Is there an objection? Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise to discuss the promotions and appointments of general and flag officers in the United States military, including several appointments to Lieutenant General and Vice Admiral. These are officers who would hold positions of particular importance and responsibility to the nation. The promotions of these military leaders were reported out of the Armed Services Committee over the past 2 months. There have been no substantive objections raised against these nominations. For the benefit of my colleagues who may not appreciate the nature and volume of military promotions and nominations considered by the Armed Services Committee, last year the committee considered and the Senate confirmed nearly 20,000 military officers, including 656 general and flag officers. The Senate confirmed 20,000 nominations through bipartisan, unanimous consent because the tradition of the committee and of the Senate is to consider military nominations as apolitical and thus process them in a timely and respectful manner so our troops do not experience delays in their promotion or appointment or in their pay and benefits. Moreover, the sheer volume of nominations we consider means we cannot subject them to the ordinary political gamesmanship we see with civilian nominations. The senior senator from Alabama has made these promotions a political matter. He, and he alone, placed a blanket hold on these officers unrelated to their qualifications because of a policy disagreement with the administration that these officers played no part in deciding. This, in my view, is a profound assault on the professionalism and the men and women of the armed services. The vast majority of these officers were selected by promotion boards, which are panels of military officers who decide the promotion purely on merit, considering the skill, talent, and the military's collective assessment of their potential to lead in the grades for which they have been nominated. Blanket political holds on military officers in an attempt to overturn a civilian policy decision sets a dangerous trend for our military, our political process, our nation, and this Senate. The senior senator from Alabama placed his hold on February 16th, and as a result, not a single general or flag officer nominated in this Congress has been confirmed. Let me repeat that. Due to the senior senator from Alabama's hold, not a single general or flag officer has been promoted. As the senator's hold moves into its 3rd month, we will quickly reach a critical mass of backlog nominations if we are not already there. That will imperil our national security, degrade unit readiness, and place undue and undeserved hardships on military families. It may not be his intent, but he is effectively accomplishing what our adversaries could only dream of, denying our military of its leadership and degrading our ability to fight and win the nation's wars. The bottom line is that military promotions are not a political matter, and they are not toys for political games, and military officers are not tokens in such a game. They are not hostages to issues that are determined by civilian authorities. An administration's civilian nominees may be fair game, and they have been repeatedly, but not professional military officers. That has long been the committee's and the Senate's tradition and practice. And I want to turn to some specific claims made by the senator from Alabama. He has asserted a number of times that the department changed the law or that DOD somehow lacked authority. That simply isn't true. To be clear, under its new policy, and this is with respect to reproductive rights for female soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and guardians, the Department of Defense will provide administrative leave and paid travel if a member of the military or the dependent is stationed in a state or country that does not provide the health care needed. The department has broad statutory authority to provide travel benefits to service members and their dependents, and it does so routinely, including for the provision of health services. I'm not aware of any assertion from anyone knowledgeable of the law and of the department's actions that the department does not have the authority to do this. Indeed, to the best of my knowledge, no serious lawyer has made this argument, and there has not been a single lawsuit filed on this matter. These policies are against travel and administration leave policies alone. They do not violate the federal prohibition on DOD paying for non-covered reproductive health services. Such reproductive health services will still be paid for by members and dependents out of their own pockets. These policies merely facilitate the provision of health services for service members and dependents who may be stationed in an area that does not provide the needed health services, including overseas locations. Further, the senior senator from Alabama has publicly stated, and I quote, "If Democrats are so worried about the nominations, then they can bring them up for a vote. We have more than enough time to vote on nominees." Setting aside the deeply troubling implication that the certain members of the Republican Party do not care enough about our national defense to ensure that senior military leaders are in place in a timely manner, it would take several months of constant attention on this floor just to move through the current batch of general and flag officers that are presently on the Senate calendar. And this is not even accounting for all the nominations still to come. If we took this path, this Senate would be consumed entirely by nominating and confirming military officers ad infinitum, unable to do anything else. And Madam President, there are currently 184 general and flag officers, including 11 to be promoted to lieutenant general or vice admiral, subject to these political holds. And let me highlight just 3 to show you the impact and the consequences of these holds. One nominee is nominated to be the commander of the Navy's 7th Fleet. It's the largest of the Navy's 4 deployed fleets and has responsibility for the Indo-Pacific area of operations. And I hear constantly in the committee and elsewhere on the floor, the Chinese threat, we've got to do more. We just listened to a long diatribe about TikTok and how dangerous it is. I think what might be more dangerous is not having a confirmed leader for this fleet in the Pacific able to move out immediately to any type of threat coming from the Chinese. In addition, the commander of the Navy's 5th Fleet, that's responsible for the naval and combined maritime forces in the Indian Ocean, Persian Gulf, Arabian Sea, and it's under the overall command of U.S. Central Command. And we hear every day, we heard it just recently, about how the Iranians are taking advantage of us. We are not responding strongly enough. Well, how well will our response be if we're not quite sure who the commander of this fleet is? We've got a nominee, but it's not confirmed. We have an officer that may have to leave for another assignment. This causes readiness problems, morale problems, and undermines the military that we all stand around here and suggest is our primary concern. Another one, the U.S. military representative to NATO, who is the senior uniformed representative to NATO during a time when NATO is critical to our support of Ukraine in its war against Russia. And again, my colleagues will stand up and say, we've got to do more for the Ukraine. We have to make sure they get the resources. We have to coordinate NATO. We have to do all these things. But we really don't need anyone in Brussels to help in military advice and assistance. We'll just ignore that. These are just 3 examples. And I'd like to look ahead because this is just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. Within the next 8 months, we expect the department to nominate approximately 650 general and flag officers, including 83 or 4-star nominees, all of whom will come through the Armed Services Committee and require Senate confirmation. These include the nomination of the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. By law, General Milley will retire in September. If this hold persists, then we will be without a chief of staff of the United States, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, rather. We also expect nominations for the service chiefs of the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. The Chief of Staff of the Army, the CNO in the Navy, and the Commandant of the Marine Corps are scheduled to retire. If this hold persists, we will not have leadership in the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. And that would be devastating to readiness, to morale, to the whole history of our government in which we moved nominees based on merit, not as political hostages. We're also talking about major combat commands. Cyber Command. Does anyone have to talk about the relevance of Cyber Command? Again, we just listened to a long discussion about cyber security and the stealing of information and governmental interference with that. Cyber Command is the key actor from the Department of Defense standpoint in all of those efforts. And frankly, without a cyber commander, I think the TikTok issue sort of diminishes in importance. We also have SpaceCom and NORTHCOM. They're responsible for the defense of the United States so that we do not find ourselves here at home devastated by any type of attack, which today includes cyber, missile, hypersonics, all those possibilities. There's also 3 deputy commanders that are coming up, Cybercom, CENTCOM, and AFRICOM. So what you can see is that this policy continues, or this practice continues, we're wiping out the leadership of the Department of Defense and doing an extraordinary disservice to the men and women that wear the uniform of the United States. We've always treated military nominations appropriately, as beyond the political fray, and we must continue to do so for the good of the service and all those who take the oath, and their families too, because no military member serves alone. The family serves with him or her. Now, I believe in a very strong military based on constitutional professional values. We must not inject political theater into this process. If we do not have a coherent, organized leadership and the Department of Defense, then we're putting our troops at risk. That's quite simple. And to me, it's unacceptable. With that, Madam, I would ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations in block: calendars number 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, 106, 107. That the nominations be confirmed en bloc The motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, and no further motions be in order to any of the nominations, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Is there an objection?
Madam President, reserving the right to object.
Senator from Alabama.
Madam President, I want to start out by mentioning the great respect I have for Senator Reid. I'm deeply grateful for the chairman's service to this country, both his service in uniform and as chairman of the Armed Services Committee, which I am a member. I believe the chairman and I agree on a lot, more than we disagree on. But I take exception to several things that have been said about me by Democratic members of this Senate. Every day this week, the majority leader has come to the floor and attacked me by name. It's not very often the majority leader of the Senate attacks a senator by name 3 days in a row. Now, my former profession, I've been called everything, so it really doesn't bother me too much. But majority leader has also tweeted about me. That's good. So let's get the record straight as we speak. Right now, I want to talk about what I've done and what I'm doing. First of all, I'm not blocking anyone from being confirmed or promoted. Every single one of these nominees can receive a vote if Senator Schumer wants it. In fact, one of the civilian nominees is getting voted on this week. If Democrats are so worried about these nominations, let's vote. If we're not going to vote on taxpayer-funded abortion, then let's vote on these nominees. Voting is our job. It's not much to ask of the United States Senate to do our job to vote. Senator Schumer and some of the other senators have claimed that my hold on these nominees is unprecedented. Well, it's not. My hold is far from unprecedented. In fact, Senator Bennett himself threatened to do this exact same thing just a few months ago. Why? Because the Air Force planned to move Space Command from Colorado to Huntsville, Alabama. We've talked about this recently. 2 years ago, we had a senator from Illinois put a hold on 1,000 nominees over the promotion of one single officer. So far, my hold has affected 184 nominations. Also note that these senators haven't said a word about our recruiting crisis that we have going on as we speak. Democrats are in a panic about 184 promotions for generals and officers, yet I have not heard a word from them about the 15,000 enlisted soldiers we're missing right now from last year's recruiting class. That's an entire division. There's another 8,600 who were discharged over the president's vaccine mandate, kicked out. I don't hear a word about that from the Democrats. The military is down 23,000 enlisted soldiers due to the actions taken by the Biden administration and his Secretary of Defense just this past year. Yet Democrats are worried about 184 generals getting their promotion. Only one of those things threatens our security. It's not officer promotion. When my dad was serving in World War II, we had one general for every 6,000 enlisted soldiers. One. Today we got one general for every 1,500. We do not suffer from a lack of generals in this country. We suffer from a lack of recruits. Military experts have known for a long time that the Pentagon is top-heavy. This entire line of attack on me is absolutely false. The generals' jobs are being done. Yet 23,000 enlisted troops that we are missing, their jobs are not being done. My Democrat friends keep saying abortion is necessary for readiness, but I have yet to hear a shred of evidence to back that up. I've been asking for months. Yet again, my Democrat friends have absolutely zero evidence to show abortion makes our troops safer, stronger, or more lethal. And let's be clear about what we're talking about. We're not talking about access to abortion. We're talking about taxpayers funding for travel and extra paid time to get elective abortions. We already have a policy. We already have a policy in the Army about abortions, and it's worked fine. But this policy includes spouses and dependents. We're talking about taxpayer funding for somebody's kids to get an abortion in another state. This has never been in the policy until now, because Congress has ensured that the Pentagon cannot perform or facilitate abortions except in legal circumstances and limited. This morning, I received an email from a soldier's mom in Alabama. She said her son has had to pay thousands of dollars out of his own pocket to buy uniforms and bed sheets. She said it is absurd to force taxpayers to pay for travel for abortions while our troops are paying out of pocket for their uniforms. She's right. She's exactly right. And that's what this is all about. Earlier today, Senator Schumer said this is about women making their own choices. That's not true. That is exactly not true. This is about taxpayer funded. That's what we're talking about. We have strict limits on taxpayer funding for abortion in this country. That's gone through this building right here. These have been bipartisan consensus for 40 years. Yet all of a sudden, Democrats are saying military can't win wars without expanding abortion. It doesn't make sense. Frankly, we have already have policies for abortion in the military. Over the last 5 years, there have been about 20 abortions a year performed in the military. These have been in cases of rape, incest, and threat to the life of the mom. Over the 40 years, I don't recall the military ever once complaining that we weren't performing enough abortions. Not one time have I heard that. Not one time. According to one report cited by the Pentagon officials to my staff, the new policy would expand taxpayer-funded abortions from 20 abortions a year to 4,000. 4,000. And who's going to pay for that? People in this country are going to pay for it. This goes beyond the law without anybody taking a vote here in this building. We were elected to pass laws. We were elected to do our job. The Department of Defense wasn't elected. They were appointed. In fact, this contradicts what Congress has actually voted for. This includes some of the people complaining the loudest. Earlier this week, 37 Democratic senators went on record in asking for the Department of Defense to go beyond the laws that they themselves have voted for. Now, in fairness, I would note that the chairman and Senator Schumer were not on that list of 37 senators. But the idea that more abortions make our troops safer and more lethal is absurd. This has been a coordinated campaign to pressure me to lift these holds. That doesn't bother me one bit, and it's not going to work. Frankly, it's just going to make me do the opposite. I'm glad the majority leader has taken notes on these holds. If Democrats want to expand taxpayer funding for abortion, then let's vote on it. I'm ready to vote on it. The majority leader, the last time I looked, controls this floor. He can make it happen. And if these nominees are so important, then we can vote on them too. So far this year, the Senate has already taken 24 days off. This is in addition to 2 weeks recess in January, and the 2 weeks recess which starts at the end of this week. I've only been here for 2 years, but I'm told this is one of the slowest years in memory around here. I don't have anything to compare it to. Sometimes we don't even vote until 5:30 on a Tuesday. People back home don't work those kind of hours, but they're expected to pay for what we're talking about. Yet the Democrats are in a panic over the idea of taking more votes. I don't mind working a full week. I worked all my life. I've had a full-time job. I'll stay here until hell freezes over. I'm not going to be intimidated by a campaign of selective outrage. And let me remind the chairman, I gave the Pentagon fair warning. I gave them fair warning. They chose to go forward with this policy. Madam President, I'd like to enter into the record this letter I sent to Secretary Austin on December the 9th, 2022.
Without objection.
Thank you. I didn't want to do this. And I told the Department of Defense that. I told the people that were in charge of all the nominations. This was the Biden administration's choice. And I'm going to keep my word. And because of that, I object.
The objection is heard.
Mr.
Senator from
President,
Rhode Island.
Reclaiming my time. First of all, the notion that we can simply start confirming these members is patently absurd. There are 180 nominations that are being held now. We anticipate another 650 general and flag officer nominations. We average, because we get very little cooperation, in fact, none at all from the Republicans, we average about 3 nominations a week. Senator Durbin knows that, because we have to wait during quorum calls to exhaust the hours necessary before we can take the final vote. So we would be working, if you do the math, 3 into 180 is 60, so maybe 60 weeks. That's only a year or so more. And then when we add the 650 additional ones, and they'll keep coming and coming and coming, it's absolutely preposterous. So that's not an answer to this problem. He mentioned Senator Duckworth. Senator Duckworth held nominations for 3 weeks because she was not trying to change a policy of the federal government, of the Trump administration. She wanted factual information whether President Trump had interfered, had politicized the military by removing Colonel Vindman's promotion. That is the exact opposite of what the senator from Alabama is doing. He's holding everybody's nomination as a political actor, just like President Trump was trying to do with Colonel Vindman, as reciprocation and as retaliation. Hearing and recruitment, we had a hearing at the request of the minority about recruitment. What are the issues there? The issues are we have a 3% unemployment rate. We have difficulties recruiting people. One of the most significant ones is that this generation has a very small group in a demographic that can be recruited. The issue of whether or not this policy affects recruiting, I think, was refuted by the senator when he indicated that he expects 4,000 people to take advantage of these travel, 4,000 women to take care of these travel advantages or disadvantages or whatever they may be. Well, that's not a trivial number, and I would suspect if women considering the military think hard, regardless of their moral position, they would not like to be in a place where they cannot get access to reproductive care. 20% of the military are women. It's going to have an effect on women. Just look at the polling across the United States about the Roe v. Wade versus the Dobbs decision, and I think you'll find a significant number of women who are concerned. So this is very simple. We're either going to politicize completely military nominations, we are going to use military officers as hostages for political decisions, and one final point. This issue will be considered in the normal order because on the National Defense Committee, I presume there will be amendments on both sides. They will be considered fairly, and this issue will be addressed as it should be in the context of the National Defense Act. What the Senator from Alabama is doing is damaging the military of the United States, perhaps catastrophically if he continues this policy for many, many more weeks. That's not appropriate. With that, I would yield the floor.
President?
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I'm here to stand in support of my friend and colleague from Alabama, Senator Tuberville, as he stands in opposition, raises his legitimate objectives, legitimate objections, which I share, to the Department of Defense's plan to use federal funds to facilitate the performance of abortions. Look, there has long been among the American people a pretty widespread supermajority of Americans, Republicans and Democrats, making up that supermajority, who say regardless of how they as individuals feel about abortion, they don't want U.S. taxpayer dollars going to fund or facilitate abortions. And that overwhelming supermajority preference for that is reflected in legislation that Congress has enacted, codified in 10 U.S.C. Section 1093. So what's happened here is the Department of Defense has very cleverly disguised it, very cleverly meandered around that so as arguably to technically comply with that statute. Instead of funding abortions, performing them on federal facilities with federal resources, they're just facilitating it, paying for the travel, expenses, air, land travel, ground travel, meals, giving 3 weeks of leave in order to perform these. So they're still using federal dollars to facilitate abortion, just in a way that it's carefully gerrymandered around the text of 10 U.S.C. Section 1093. Now, I want to echo what Senator Tuberville said a moment ago about Senator Jack Reed. I have profound respect for him. I admire him as a Senate friend and colleague, as the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, as himself somebody who has given enormously to his country with his service through the military and otherwise. I do want to respond to a couple of points that he made, because I don't think they lead where Senator Reed intended them to lead. He repeatedly described this as a civilian policy decision. Yes, this does embody a civilian policy decision, and it's a policy decision that is fundamentally legislative in nature. Now, if he wanted this made, he could have easily come to Congress. The Congress, including the United States Senate, has long been very deferential to the Department of Defense. When it comes to us and says, we need this or that, this will help us perform our mission to keep our nation safe and protected from threats to our national security. We are a pretty generous bunch, especially when it comes to DOD. So why didn't they do that? Well, I think they didn't do that. I know they didn't do that for one simple reason. They knew that the answer would be no. So yes, the civilian policy decision. Last I checked, the organ, the branch of the federal government that makes civilian policy decisions that affect the country, that bind the country with law, is this branch. We are the ones who get to set that. Now, sure, they're authorized to make a number of their own internal operating decisions. But whereas here, a policy is so blatantly at odds with the fundamental spirit of federal statute enacted into law, they've gone around us, they've carefully written it so as to gerrymander this policy around 10 U.S.C. Section 1093. They wanted nothing to do with us. So what Senator Tuberville is doing here is standing up for our prerogative as lawmakers. Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1 says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. They want to go around that. I get that. But when they want to go around that and start doing our job, our prerogative is to tell them it's going to take you a little longer to get some people confirmed. And well, yeah, it would be very inconvenient if they had to go through the additional hoops. Not impossible. They could do it. They could start. They could get a number of people confirmed. But they're asking Senator Tuberville to make it easy for them. They want to have their cake and eat it too. So if they want his cooperation, they need to respect the legislative prerogatives of the Senate for which he is standing today. And I admire him for doing that and stand with him in this. As far as not injecting politics, political decision-making, into the Department of Defense itself, he's got that exactly backwards. Mr. President, He's making a political decision overriding our prerogative to do that and then blaming us for the issue. Finally, with regard to Senator Reid's suggestion that we could deal with this in the National Defense Authorization Act coming before the Senate in the coming months, I get the point. If he's serious about that, I'd like to suggest something to Senator Tuberville, and we can talk about this offline, perhaps after we vote. I suspect that if the Department of Defense wanted to really stand behind that, they could offer to suspend this regulation that they've issued, this policy memorandum they issued on February 16th. Suspend that until such time as we can debate it, discuss it, and work on it in the NDAA. Look, let this be a message to Secretary Austin. If you want to make the laws, run for Congress, but you can't legislate from the E-ring at the Pentagon. You cannot do that. Until then, stand down and leave the lawmaking to lawmakers.
Senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, as a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee and chair of the Readiness Subcommittee, I rise today deeply opposed to the dangerous posturing of my colleague from Alabama in playing with our national security. That's what it's coming down to. So in the Senate, we have a long history of bipartisan support for our armed services and our service members. What is not usual is for one member of the Senate to put a hold on hundreds of nominees because, let's face it, for political and ideological reasons. I don't know how else you would characterize his actions. So while we may disagree about military policy, obviously we do, we have always kept the readiness of our forces above politics. But now the senator from Alabama is intentionally politicizing our military. And you all can stand there all you want and say you're not politicizing. Oh, really? I beg to differ. By blocking numerous promotions simply because he is upset that the DoD is doing its part to protect our service members and addressing their needs. Our service members, our women, have a need to access appropriate reproductive care. Now, this wasn't an issue before because guess what? We didn't have a Supreme Court that upended almost 50 years of a constitutional right that women in this country had. So, why is this important? Because we never had a Dobbs decision before, but now we have. That's what we have to live with. So because of the senator's reckless posturing and unyielding stance, the promotions of more than 160 flag officers, men and women who have dedicated their lives to serving our country, are already being delayed. And these delays pose a grave and growing threat to our national security and the readiness of our troops. And in the next several months, we are set to consider the nominations of nearly half of the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, including the chairman. At a time when we face growing threats around the world, leaving these roles unfulfilled would have catastrophic consequences for our military and our national security. Just yesterday, Secretary Austin was before the Armed Services Committee, on which Senator Tuberville and I both sit, and he told us, Secretary Austin told us, quote, not approving the recommendations for promotions actually creates a ripple effect through the forces that makes us far less ready than we need to be, end quote. What's worse, this hold is all because the Department of Defense is allowing service members to access reproductive health care, something well within the department's authority. As a result, as I mentioned, of the Supreme Court's disastrous Dobbs decision, nearly 80,000 women service members. You know what? You care about recruiting and retaining service members? How about wanting to retain and recruit female service members? So with this Dobbs decision, we now have 80,000 women service members are now stationed in states where they can't fully access reproductive care. And to address this crisis brought on by the Supreme Court's decision, the DoD adopted a common sense policy to allow those service members to travel to get the care they need. And to be clear, this policy does not cover the cost of abortions. We are not talking about taxpayer-paid abortions. You know, it would be really great if we could just adhere to facts. You say that this is really a roundabout way to pay for abortions. No, this is a very direct way to meet the needs of our female service members to get the health care and the reproductive care that they so plainly need. Secretary Austin has said that the health of our service members must be a top priority. Who can argue with that? I couldn't agree more, and I applaud Secretary Austin's leadership on this issue. But clearly, my colleague from Alabama is more concerned with pushing his ideological agenda than the realities our troops face. Mr. President, our service members put their lives on the line for our country. They deserve better than to be used as political props. And frankly, this obsession that the Republicans have to have power and control over women's bodies, what's up with that? For the sake of our country and our troops, I urge my colleague from Alabama, my colleague from Utah, to drop this dangerous crusade and confirm the military nominations en banc. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President, I'd like to respond 30 seconds. I ask unanimous consent to 30 seconds. I'd love to respond to that point.
Is there objection? Without objection.
To the senator from Hawaii, I'd be happy, I'd be thrilled to accept that request, and I will accept it right now. Can't speak for Senator Tuberville, I can speak for myself. I will absolutely accept that right now. Get them all done. Get the Pentagon to lift this policy, to suspend it until we can get it ironed out on the NDAA. I'll agree to that right now. If this is as bad, as dire, as apocalyptic, dogs and cats living together in the streets, Book of Revelation stuff, as you describe it, then we should do that. But lift the policy. You can't legislate from the E-ring of the Pentagon. We will stand up for our rights, and we must.
Mr. President, very briefly, we are going to be working on NDAA, and I suggest to my colleagues, go ahead, put an amendment or whatever you want in the NDAA, and let's take a vote on it on whether or not that this policy should stand.
Under the previous
Fine,
order,
let's do it.
the senator from Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you so much, and I appreciate so much the senator from Hawaii's perspective on this really important issue, and it is a really important issue. I mean, there's been some discussion on the other side about how for 50 years there's been a consensus in this chamber about how we treat these issues, ignoring completely what the Dobbs decision has done to this country, which is to strip a 50-year constitutional right, to strip a 50-year constitutional freedom from the American people. It is the first time since Reconstruction that a right has been stripped from the American people by the Supreme Court, and it has been a 50-year crusade, an agenda by the allies of the people across this aisle to accomplish that. There was a lot earlier, Mr. President, I heard about, well, I didn't learn that in law school. I didn't learn that in law school today about the First Amendment and their debate about TikTok. Well, when I was in law school, that is when originalism was injected into the bloodstream of conservative legal thought in this country. It had not existed before. It was something that was invented by Justice Scalia when he was a law professor and grabbed onto by a lot of people on the other side of the aisle to justify a deeply conservative view of economic history in America. I'd ask my colleagues to allow me to give the rest of my speech before they use profanity on the floor of the Senate to describe what I'm talking about.
The Senate will be in order. Members are asked to take their conversations off the
I'm
floor.
not offended by that. I just think some of the people at home may not want to hear that kind of language on the floor of the Senate. But that's because they know what I'm saying is true about originalism. And because of their efforts, and because they were able to elect Donald Trump, who was not actually read in on the joke, we ended up with 3 people on the Supreme Court who subscribe to that originalist view, and who decided, following Justice Alito, that if it was not a freedom in 1868, that it's not a freedom in 2023. Even though it has been a freedom and a right for the last 50 years in this country. So don't come here and say that there was somehow a consensus here when that freedom and that right has been stripped from the American people by the Supreme Court. And then my colleague from Alabama, who's left the floor, by the way, Mr. President, just on that point, he has now twice misrepresented my actions on this floor. And so I would ask for the record to include this article from Politico, which my colleague from Alabama put in the record the last time he was here misrepresenting my record. I'd like to put exactly the same article in the record so people can actually see the truth of my record, Mr.
Without
President.
objection.
And I want to thank, he's gone, the Senator from Alabama, for finding an article in Politico about me, because it is so seldom that any article is written about me. I'm grateful that he's called attention to it. He's not here for me to say thank you for that. But he's now on the floor doing something that no senator has ever done, holding up every single flag officer's promotion in this country, 180 of them or so now, maybe 600 of them, the head of the 7th Fleet, the head of the 5th Fleet. These are vital offices that he is holding up. He just said, we've got enough generals. We have enough generals. Why is he doing it? Why is he doing it? He's doing it because he is offended by a regulation that the Department of Defense has promulgated in the wake of the Dobbs decision, reversing Roe versus Wade, stripping the American people of this fundamental right, stripping the American people of this fundamental right. And in the wake of that, the Secretary of Defense had the nerve to say, if you are serving through no decision that you've made in a state like Alabama that has banned abortion, and you have to travel to another state to get an abortion, we'll pay for that. Travel. If you need a little bit of extra time, the regulations say, before you go to your commanding officer and tell them that you have to have a medical procedure like abortion, it gives you a little extra time to do that. The third thing it does, Mr. President, is that it says that if you have to leave the state of Alabama because you can't have access to abortion there, that you don't have to use paid leave. That's the 3 things this rule does. That's all. I'm coming to an end, Mr. President. That is all it does. That is all it does. In his world, he would like to have a place where people did not have their travel paid for. They had to use their paid leave, and they had to tell their commanding officer immediately. That's the America he wants to live in, because he lives in a state.
Senator's time has expired.
I'd ask the Senate for 30 more seconds.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you. He is entitled to his opinion, certainly. And the state of Alabama has a totally different approach to a woman's right to choose than Colorado does, and I respect that even though we differ. But in Alabama, there are no exceptions for rape or incest. In Alabama, if you're a doctor who's committed an abortion, you can go to jail for 99 years. In Alabama, they are trying to say that women that use chemicals that many women use
Senator's time has expired.
to end their abortion. And all we're saying is we need to recognize what's happened since Dobbs, and we need
The senator's
to,
time has
Thank you.
expired.
I yield the floor. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Mr. President,
Senator from Kansas.
Mr. President, I rise today in support of H.J. Res. 7, a bill that will immediately terminate the COVID-19 National Emergency Declaration. Over a year ago, this body voted to end the COVID National Emergency Declaration. Actually, it's been a year and 26 days ago. And then it was just 5 months ago, this body voted for a second time to end the COVID national emergency with an overwhelming bipartisan vote of 61 to 37. Today, we hope the third time is the charm and that the rumors are true that the president will finally sign this legislation and end this chapter of physical, mental, and financial strife seldom seen in our world's modern history. Emergency powers are given to the executive branch so the commander-in-chief has the flexibility to quickly act in the event of a crisis. That declaration was appropriate in 2020, but now it's time for the proper constitutional checks and balances to be restored. It's time to end any and all authoritarian control and unilateral spending decisions without congressional consent. Many, many Kansans have asked me, what's the holdup? Why is the White House waiting to end this emergency declaration? Well, sadly, I have to tell them, because the National Emergency Declaration has allowed the administration to justify increased spending and push harmful mandates. Under this national emergency, we've seen a massive increase in government spending across the board. This spending over the past 2 years has resulted in the highest level of inflation Americans have encountered in 40 years. The gross federal debt that has increased by $3.7 trillion. $3.7 trillion since this president took office, an increase of 12%. And we've sadly watched as interest rates hikes combined with skyrocketing inflation has raised the amount of debt many Americans hold and made almost everything cost more. On top of all this, the authority granted to the president by this emergency declaration has been the direct justification for the White House's efforts to cancel as much as $20,000 in debt for federal student loan holders, a plan that would cost taxpayers an additional $400 billion. Now, we all understand what it means when politicians say, never let a good crisis go to waste. But it doesn't stop there. When the national emergency is in place, the administration has also moved to mandate vaccines for private companies with 100 or more employees. If not halted by the courts, this massive federal overreach would have forced millions of Americans to choose between the jab or their job. Next, the White House tried to force healthcare workers, federal employees and contractors, and even members of our military to receive the vaccine against their choice. Thankfully, these were also halted by the courts across the country. These are the consequences of a 3-year emergency declaration. Take a good look at the decisions made under this prolonged, supersized government rule, and you'll quickly understand why our founding fathers warned of this type of abuse of power when they authored the Constitution and made it a top priority to keep each branch of government in line with systems of checks and balances. I come to the floor today, hopefully, for one last vote on terminating this declaration. Is the emergency indeed over? Well, our president himself said as much in September 2022 interview on CBS's 60 Minutes, and I quote the
senator will
president's direct
suspend.
words,
The Senate will
pandemic
come to
is
order.
over.
The senator from Kansas.
And I quote the president's direct words, the pandemic is over. Enough is enough. It's time to end this chapter and let Americans get back to their own lives. I ask my colleagues to join me again in a strong bipartisan fashion in sending this resolution to the president's desk to end the national emergency declaration for COVID-19 once and for all today. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The clerk will read the joint resolution for the third time.
Calendar number 33, House Joint Resolution 7, relating to a national emergency